All right, so we'll start the actual first chapter. Standard internet networking models. As I said before, the first few chapters, it's a lot of memorization, and unfortunately it's a lot of stuff where you're just going to have to memorize it straight up. I know there's a lot of little tricks people can use for some of it, but yeah. So types of internet networks. Here's a quick listing. Local area networks, the LAN. You guys should be very familiar with these. The answer's in the name. The local area, what your computer is directly connected to on the router in most situations. Metropolitan area networks, MANs. They're larger than a LAN, smaller than a WAN is the best way to put it. A lot of times, like if a business, they don't really do this so much anymore because WAN technology has increased so much. But 8-10 years ago, whenever you had multiple business sites in the same city, they would just set up these satellite connections between the two, so that you had this connection that traveled across 4 or 5 miles. On all these, especially like the metropolitan area networks and the storage area networks, you really just kind of need to know what they are. You don't really have to know a whole lot about the inner workings or the history. Wide area networks, you guys should know a lot about these already too, especially if you're in the NOC. DSL, T1, basically something connecting you to the public internet in most cases, or possibly an MPLS VPN environment. Storage area networks, if you guys worked in IT or technology, the 2 rooms that they've got over there in the NOC where they've got all of our servers hooked up to storage and all that kind of stuff, that is a SAN, storage area network. You've got all your hard drives and your servers and all that stuff in one place connected. And then VPNs, virtual private networks, a lot of you guys should know about these as well. A private network to connect, in our case, a lot of individual store franchisees into a headquarters. This one's a big one. You will have to memorize the OSI model. There's no way around not memorizing the OSI model. I'm trying to remember, just ballpark, I had at least 4 or 5 questions just straight up on the OSI model, and then a lot of other questions that were indirectly related to the OSI model on my test. Some of the questions you'll get will be, what kind of protocol, here's a protocol, which layer does it belong to, or maybe even putting all the layers in the correct order. They always start from the top up. I actually like to think of it from the bottom down because of the environment we work in. But working from the bottom down, layer 1, physical layer, whatever physical medium you're using to connect Ethernet, physical Ethernet cables, not to be confused with the Ethernet and the data link layer. Physical Ethernet cables, fiber cables, coaxial cables, that's the physical layer. On top of that, you've got your data link layer. Think of this as sync. Especially you guys are working on DSL all the day. DSL sync is layer 2, data link layer. You connect even on a local router, connecting an Ethernet cable and getting a solid link light on that. That's the data link layer. When we get into that, we'll start talking about Ethernet frames. That seems to be the big medium in use today. Above that, network layer, the IP layer, layer 3. Once again, most of you guys, especially in the NOC, are going to be very familiar with this. That covers IP, routing of IP, that kind of thing. Layer 4, the transport layer, sits just above IP and can usually be thought of as UDP and TCP, port numbers, that kind of thing. And then above that, you've got your session, which basically sets up as it says, sessions of data between 2 links. Above that, presentation. Usually this is raw file formats for going into presentation, like GIF files, JPEGs. Those are all part of the presentation layer. And then at the very top, you have your application layer, which is, you guys are using a program, something like that. Obviously, that's an application. On the left-hand side, you'll see that they've got the different data units listed as well. That's going to be something you're going to have to memorize as well. Basically, anything in the top 3 layers is going to be data. When you go down to the bottom, you start with bits. Physical, surges in electricity, 0s and 1s are bits. Groups of bits are put together into frames, and then frames are put together in packets. Packets are put together in segments. and then after that, you're all data. So the application layer, here's a lot of examples. Telnet, HTTPS, HTTP, file transfer protocol, trivial file transfer protocol, domain name services, simple mail transfer protocol, POP3 email, NFS, NNTP, SNMP, NTP, DHCP. All these guys are application on a raw level. Presentation layer, as I said before, this is the actual formats for presenting things: JPEG, ASCII code, TIFF, GIF, PICT, MPEG, MIDI, QuickTime, RTF. And RTF is actually, I was thinking of RTP. I was thinking that was out of place, but no, that's actually correct. Session layer. NTP, DHCP, NFS, SQL databases, all that's part of the session layer. All of this stuff, like, you guys don't really have to memorize per se, but like on a lot of the big ones, like when you get questions on the test, they're gonna be questions that are like, a telnet belongs to what layer, or JPEG belongs to what layer, and you're going to have to be able to accurately like place those. Or you might have a question where it's like 6 answers, and which of the following 3 belong to the presentation layer, and you'd have to be able to accurately pick which 3 of the 6 answers fit into one of these types of formats. Okay, and now we get to the fun stuff. Transport layer, responsible for fault detection, error recovery, establishing, maintaining, and tearing down virtual circuits. TCP and UDP are the big ones. SPX, I guess, is still in there. It's kind of less used. Transport layer provides reliable networking via acknowledgement, sequencing, and flow control. Basically, making sure the packets get there in the right order. And as I said already, layer 4 protocols include TCP and UDP. I'll go into those. I don't know if it's on these slides or if it's later in the chapter. I know we're going to go pretty in depth on TCP and UDP, what's included in those, and that kind of thing. Network layer, the IP layer, controls routing of data. Protocols include IP, IPX, which is not heavily used anymore. I don't know that I had any questions involving IPX on the test. AppleTalk DDP, I doubt I had any questions on that either. You really just need to think of this as the IP layer. That's pretty much what it is. There are 2 types of packets. Data packets, which is the actual information that's being sent out, and then route update packets, which sends the routes to neighboring routers. So when you hear a question like a routed protocol versus a routing protocol, we'll get into that later. A routing protocol would be like RIP or OSPF or BGP, and a routed protocol would be basically anything else you've seen above this: IP, TCP, UDP, etc.